I watched Thomas sitting at the kitchen table with a weary and grim expression on his face. In recent weeks, he had become distant, silent, almost detached. His usual cheerfulness had vanished like a summer mist at dawn. I tried not to give it too much thought, convincing myself it was just stress from work, but a sense of unease grew inside me. One evening, while tidying up the kitchen, my eyes accidentally fell on a stack of documents carelessly thrown on the table. Among them were several letters with a red stripe on the edge, a sign that made me tense up. I picked one up and saw the name of an unfamiliar company. Debt notice, the bold text read on the front page. I soon realized it was some unscrupulous company promising quick money in exchange for insignificant interest rates. But I knew these companies always demanded far more than they gave, trapping people in a web of debt that was hard to escape. It seemed Thomas hadn't been able to get a loan from a regular bank and had been forced to turn to them. Panic started to build within me. The amounts on the notices were staggering. I realized our debt was much larger than I could have imagined. Thomas, it seemed, had been trying to hide it from me, hoping to find a solution on his own. But his silence only made things worse. The evenings grew darker and more tense. Thomas left for work early and returned late, avoiding conversations about money or any attempts to explain what was happening. I understood he was drowning, and I tried to help him, but it was as if he had built an invisible wall around himself, shutting everyone out, including me. I could no longer remain in the dark. Determined to uncover the truth, I went to the office of this company. The atmosphere in the room was strange and oppressive. Dim lighting, cracked walls, and the gloomy faces of the employees who closely watched my every move. In a conversation with the manager, I learned that our debt was enormous, and the interest kept growing at an alarming rate. We were trapped, and there was no easy way out. I couldn't calm down after my visit to that grim company. We were drowning in debt, and every day the situation seemed to worsen. Thomas kept stubbornly ignoring my questions, and my fears grew stronger. I knew I had to do something. I needed to meet those who ran this ruthless business and try to find a solution that would get us out of this nightmare. The next day, I decided to arrange a meeting with the collectors. We agreed to meet at an old cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place where time seemed to have stopped. Fallen leaves swirled outside the windows, and everything around seemed to breathe coldness and detachment. I arrived early and sat at a corner table, feeling my hands trembling inside. When they entered, a chill ran down my spine. Two men in their 40s, dressed in simple but well-fitted suits, approached me. One of them, tall and dark-haired, introduced himself as Victor. The other, shorter and sturdier, did not give his name, merely nodding in my direction. Their cold gazes pierced me, as if they could see right through me. Victor began speaking calmly and steadily, as if discussing business matters rather than the destruction of someone's life. "We are aware of your situation, Mrs. Emma," he said, keeping his hands on the table. "The amount of debt is substantial, and as you understand, the repayment terms are not very flexible." I felt a lump in my throat. "I understand," I replied. "But maybe we can find some sort of compromise? I'm willing to do everything I can to repay the debt." Victor exchanged a glance with his silent companion, then leaned toward me, his voice becoming softer and more insistent. "We have a proposal," he said. "If you agree to be our special guest for 1 month, fulfilling all our requirements, we can reduce your debt by half." My eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a tight knot of fear in my chest. "You would participate in our events," he continued with a smile that promised nothing good. "It's just a month, Mrs. Emma, and we're willing to cut your debt." I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. I stood up, my legs shaking. "No, I said, barely holding back tears. That's impossible. They exchanged knowing looks, as if expecting my refusal. Think about it, Mrs. Emma, Victor said as they left. You have until the end of the week. But remember, this might be your only chance. Back home, I couldn't calm down for a long time. Victor's words echoed in my head. I couldn't shake the thought that this might be our only way to avoid total collapse. Night fell, and then another. Thomas still knew nothing, and I couldn't tell him what the collectors had proposed to me. His reaction could be unpredictable, and the consequences catastrophic. Days passed, and I realized I was standing on the edge of an abyss. Gazing into the darkness around me, I made a decision that could change my entire life. The days dragged on unbearably slowly, as if the world around me was frozen, waiting for my decision. My thoughts were tangled, and my feelings were heightened to the extreme. Victor's words echoed in my head. This might be your only chance. I felt cornered, and every time I tried to find another way out, it slipped through my fingers like sand. The day I made the decision, my heart was racing. I wrote to Victor, agreeing to his terms. He responded briefly, stating he would expect me at our first meeting on Friday evening. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was doing this for Thomas, for our future, for our home, which could be threatened at any moment. But inside, I felt disgust and fear, as if I had betrayed myself. Friday evening came faster than I had expected. Victor sent me the address, a luxurious hotel in the city center, a name I had only heard in passing. As I approached the tall building, my heart pounded wildly in my chest. I entered the lobby and approached the reception, giving my name, and was immediately escorted to the elevator. Pressing the button for the desired floor, I tried not to think about what awaited me upstairs. The elevator doors opened, and John, one of the men from the cafe, greeted me. He smiled at me as if we were old acquaintances, but I saw a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Good evening, Emma," he said, inviting me into a spacious and luxurious room filled with soft light. Several men were already in the room, all strangers, and I felt uncomfortable under their watchful gazes. John seemed to immediately take on the role of host. He moved closer to me, his hand lightly touching my shoulder. "We're glad you decided to join us," he said with a slight smile, but there was an underlying threat in his voice. I tried to force a smile, though I was trembling inside. I felt humiliated and afraid, but I reminded myself that I was here for Thomas, for our salvation. John offered me a glass of wine, which I accepted, though my fingers could barely hold the glass. My head throbbed, my heart pounded so hard it seemed its beat echoed throughout the room. "Why don't you stay the night?" John suddenly suggested, looking at me as if it was the most natural offer in the world. His eyes glistened, and I felt a chill seep into my body. I didn't know how to respond. Inside me, a storm raged. I wanted to refuse, to leave, to forget this evening like a bad dream. But every bit of resistance met the grim reality. Our debts, the looming threat over our home, the despair in Thomas's eyes. I took a deep breath and nodded, trying to hold back the tears welling up in my eyes. John smirked, as if sensing my inner turmoil, and gestured toward the door at the far end of the room. "Then let's go," he said, his hand gently but insistently touching my back, nudging me in the right direction. Every step felt like a step into an abyss, and every movement resonated with pain inside me. I felt humiliation and fear, but kept repeating to myself that I was doing this for Thomas and our future. Yet something inside me clenched and screamed that perhaps this price was too high, even to save the family. My life had become one of constant deception. At home, I tried to be a caring wife, smiling at Thomas as if nothing had changed. But inside, I felt empty. The heavy burden of my secrets weighed on my shoulders, becoming more unbearable with each passing day. Every morning, I hoped it was just a nightmare I would soon wake up from, but reality was far worse. The collectors didn't let me enjoy the illusion of peace for long. Their demands grew more intrusive. Every week, they found new reasons to contact me. My phone was constantly buzzing with their calls and messages, and each one made me flinch. I knew I was becoming a hostage to their terms. Their desire for control over my life seemed limitless. John, in particular, messaged me often. His messages came at all hours, and at first they were formal, almost businesslike. But as the days passed, his tone grew more personal. He began to show me more warmth, as if he was trying to create an illusion of closeness between us. "How are you today, Emma? I hope you're having a good day." Messages like these became routine. I sensed a hidden threat behind this politeness, but I didn't know how to respond. John started finding excuses to meet more often. He said we needed to discuss details or strengthen our cooperation. I felt that each time I agreed to another meeting, I was becoming more vulnerable. His tone was soft, almost caring, but I knew something sinister lay beneath this exterior. One day, after an especially tough day, I met John in a small cafe. He looked unusually calm, even relaxed. When he approached me, his smile was friendly, but his eyes were cold. "Emma," he began, "I want you to know that I'm on your side. I understand what you're going through." I looked at him, unsure of what to say. He continued, without looking away, "You can trust me. I just want to help you get through this." His voice was gentle, but something inside me protested. I couldn't believe he genuinely wanted to help. I felt he had hidden motives. With each passing day, John tried to get closer to me. He would call me in the evenings when I was home with Thomas, his voice sounding like we were old friends rather than strangers brought together by debt and desperation. He began to talk to me about his life, his feelings, as if trying to evoke sympathy from me. But I knew there was more behind it. His attention became obsessive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wanted something more from me than just cooperation. I tried to stay calm and not show Thomas how hard it was for me. But every touch, every look from him reminded me that I was living in a double reality. I tried to believe that I could get through this and preserve our future. But every day, I felt more and more that I was losing control over my life, and perhaps even over my soul. I felt trapped, with no way out. Every day it became clearer that breaking the agreement with the collectors would mean signing my own death warrant. They made it clear that the consequences would be severe if I tried to leave. These people knew no pity, no compassion. In their eyes, I was just another debtor, whose future depended on their mercy. The situation was getting worse, and I felt like I was sinking deeper and deeper. John never missed an opportunity to remind me of his protection. He began paying me more attention, calling me more often than usual. His voice was soft and calming, but I sensed a cold calculation behind it. "Emma," he said one evening when I picked up his call, "you know I can protect you from the others, right? You just need to stay close to me. I'll make sure no one else disturbs your peace." His words sounded like an offer, but I felt a hidden threat. I knew that if I agreed, my dependence on John would only grow stronger, and I wouldn't be able to escape this web. I refused his offer, trying not to show how frightened I was. "No, John, thank you," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I can handle it myself." He was silent for a few moments, then quietly said, "As you wish, Emma. But don't forget, the world can be a harsh place, especially for those who try to go it alone." After that call, I felt even worse. John clearly wasn't going to back down, and his persistence only heightened my sense of anxiety. I tried to avoid his calls, but he found ways to reach me, messages, unexpected meetings in town, hints that he was always nearby. Meanwhile, Thomas began to notice something was wrong. He sensed my tension, noticed my sudden disappearances and strange calls. One evening, when I was trying to hide my phone, he asked, "Emma, are you hiding something from me?" My heart stopped for a moment. I knew I couldn't tell him the truth. He would never understand. He would feel betrayed, humiliated. I knew it would destroy our relationship completely. So I was forced to lie. "No, Thomas. Everything is fine," I replied with a smile, but I could feel how strained that smile was. "Just a lot of stress at work." He nodded, but I could see his eyes lingering on my hand holding the phone. I knew that time was working against me. Thomas was too observant, and I couldn't keep the truth from him forever. But to tell him would mean losing him forever, and that was a price I couldn't pay. Every day I felt the noose tightening around me. I feared that John or someone from his team might reveal the truth. Then what? Thomas would leave me, and my life would collapse completely. But I still couldn't bring myself to accept John's offer. I felt that behind his kindness, something dark was lurking, that he wanted more from me than just closeness. Everything collapsed in a single moment, like a house of cards. Furious at my refusal, John decided to take drastic measures. That evening, I returned home later than usual, trying to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake Thomas. I had grown accustomed to the tension between us and hoped that tonight I could avoid his suspicious looks and questions. But when I opened the door, I saw Thomas already sitting in the living room, under the light of a table lamp. His face was tense, his eyes red with either exhaustion or anger. He was holding his phone, and I realized something had happened. "Emma," he said, his voice low and strained. "John called me." I froze. My heart pounded wildly, cold fear gripping me from within. "John," I repeated, trying to buy some time, not showing my anxiety. "Yes, John," Thomas continued, his voice growing louder, his eyes flashing with fury. "He told me everything, about your meetings with the collectors and how you became their special guest." Thomas's words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I felt the ground slipping from under my feet. "Let me explain," I began. But he didn't let me finish. "Explain?" He cut me off, getting up from the couch. "How could you do this? How could you secretly meet with them, spend time in their company, and pretend everything was fine?" "I was trying to save us," I said, trying to stay calm, but my voice trembled with emotion. "I did it for us, so we wouldn't lose our home, so we would have a chance to pay off the debt." But Thomas wasn't listening, his face contorted with pain and anger. "You betrayed me, Emma. You didn't even try to talk to me. You decided everything for both of us, playing this dirty game. How could you?" I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I tried to hold them back. "I didn't know what else to do," I whispered. "I thought it was the only way to save us." "You only thought about yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "About yourself and your decisions. You never thought about me, about how I feel." I tried to take a step toward him, but he backed away, as if I were poisonous. "Thomas, please, understand." "No," his voice was firm and final. "I can't trust you anymore. I don't know who you are now." He turned and left the room, leaving me standing there in silence and darkness. I stood there, realizing that everything I had tried to do for our family had turned against me. Thomas didn't understand that I had done it for us. To him, it was a betrayal he couldn't forgive. I was left alone, in an empty house, with the bitter realization that I might have lost everything I loved. I felt my world crumbling around me. Everything I had done to save our family had been in vain. Instead of solving our problems, I had only destroyed the trust between us. Thomas could not forgive me. He avoided me, not even wanting to look in my direction. His silence was louder than any words, and I felt I was losing him more and more with each passing day. I tried to rebuild our relationship. I tried to talk to him, to explain that my actions were driven by desperation, that I only wanted to save us. But every time I began a conversation, his face grew colder, his eyes empty. He didn't want to listen. Every time he withdrew, as if every word I spoke caused him pain. The days became unbearable. Thomas avoided me not only in our home but also in everyday life. He came and went like a ghost, silently passing by me. The evenings were particularly hard. In the silence of our house, I felt increasingly lonely and disappointed. Every time I saw him, my heart ached with pain. I began to realize that my sacrifice had been in vain. I hadn't saved our marriage. I hadn't kept our family together. I had only destroyed everything we had. Thomas seemed unable to forgive me for what I had done, and the more he distanced himself, the more I realized I had lost him. Meanwhile, the collectors did not relent. They continued to demand compliance with their conditions, threatening me with new problems if I didn't obey. They said that now I would have to pay for my disobedience. I felt the noose tightening, and there seemed to be no way out. I could no longer endure this pressure. Every morning began with anxiety, and every night was filled with fear. All my efforts to save the family had only backed me into a corner from which there seemed to be no escape. I tried to find a way to negotiate with the collectors, but they didn't want to listen. They wanted more than I could give. Every day I woke up thinking that maybe today things would change. But nothing changed. Thomas remained closed off to me, and the collectors' threats only grew stronger. I realized that everything I had done was not only meaningless, but also destructive. I had lost everything I cared about, and now I was left alone in the dark, cold world of my mistakes and regrets. After days of suffering and disappointment, I made a decision. I would leave the city. I hoped that a change of scenery would help me regain my mental balance and perhaps start a new life. I didn't know how to find peace again, but I was sure that a change was the only thing that could help me. I packed quickly. Packing was hard. Each item reminded me of what I was leaving behind. I couldn't take too much, so I packed only the essentials. When everything was ready, I got into the car and headed to a friend's place, who had agreed to take me in. She was ready to listen and help, and I hoped that by leaving the city, I could give Thomas time to think and maybe find a solution to our problem. The drive was long and tiring, but I tried to focus on the future I hoped to build. I dreamed of finding peace and starting a new life where there would be no debts or betrayal. But on the way, my dreams of peace were shattered. Suddenly, a few cars appeared on the side of the road. I recognized them. These were the people I had seen before when dealing with the collectors. Panic gripped me as they intercepted my car. One of the men, the same one I had encountered before, approached the window. His face was serious, and I saw the hardness in his eyes. "Emma, where do you think you're going?" His voice was harsh and commanding. I rolled down the window, trying not to show my fear. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to stay calm. "I just want to get away and start a new life." He only smirked. "You can't just leave, Emma. You know you're obligated to fulfill the terms of our agreement. We're not going to let you go until you complete your obligations." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. "But I'm trying. I'm doing everything I can." Every day, I grew more aware that there was no way out. The collectors left me no choice but to continue complying with their demands. My situation was becoming increasingly dangerous and overwhelming. I felt the grip of fear and despair tightening around me as I realized I was trapped with no escape. The collectors began demanding more and more meetings from me. They knew I couldn't leave, and they used that knowledge to force me to meet their conditions. I had to attend their gatherings, spend time in their company, as if I were their prisoner. Their demands grew more intrusive and harsh. "If you don't continue to meet your obligations," one of them said at a recent meeting, "we'll start spreading rumors about your behavior. Your family and friends will find out the truth. You wouldn't want everyone to know, would you?" These threats were real, and I couldn't afford for anyone to find out what was happening. I continued to meet with them, pretending that everything was fine. But deep down, I felt my life crumbling. Every time I tried to find a way out of this trap, I faced new obstacles. I tried to talk to John, pleaded with him to ease the demands, but he only smirked and said it was impossible. I sought help, but no one could assist me. I was surrounded by enemies, and my attempts to find a solution only led to more complications. Night after night, I woke from troubled thoughts, and each day became increasingly unbearable. I felt like a bird in a cage, unable to escape despite all my efforts. My attempts to improve the situation only deepened the problem. The collectors were always nearby, always in control, and I didn't know how to break free from their grasp. I realized that the only way to escape this nightmare was to run away. The night became my ally, and I decided to use it to break free from the city that had become my prison. I planned my escape meticulously, making sure to avoid any unnecessary risks. Every action was thought out in detail. I packed only the essentials and carefully ensured nothing would reveal my plan. That night, I waited until everything had quieted down. When the clock struck midnight and I was sure no one was watching, I quietly left the apartment. In the darkness, I felt like a shadow, and despite my fear, I knew this was my only chance. My car was parked in a secluded spot, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I slid into the driver's seat, driving away from the city. I could hardly believe I was managing to leave, but I couldn't afford to relax just yet. I drove for miles, trying not to think about what I was leaving behind. In the new city, I started from scratch. Everything was new and unfamiliar. I found modest accommodation and secured a job that helped me feel like I was part of society again. But every day was filled with the fear that the collectors might find me again. I couldn't allow myself to forget them, even as I tried to build a new life. The first days were challenging. I tried to forget everything that had happened and focus on my new beginning. I worked hard, attempting to leave the past behind and not think about the looming threat. But every time I heard a noise at the door or received an unexpected letter, my fear flared up again. I was constantly on edge, afraid that the collectors would reappear in my life. Even though I tried to live normally, the fear and anxiety were always with me. I knew I couldn't afford to let my guard down, and that I had to remain vigilant to avoid falling into the same trap again. My new beginning was overshadowed by constant apprehension, but I tried to move forward, one day at a time. After months of silence, Thomas finally decided to take a step that could change everything. He began to realize that my actions were not simply acts of betrayal, but were driven by desperation and an attempt to save our family. He understood that perhaps I had acted out of a belief that there was no other choice. Thomas found a way to contact me. He wrote a letter acknowledging his mistakes and expressed a desire to meet and discuss what had happened. He wanted to understand what motivated me and perhaps find a way to reconcile. I felt old feelings of guilt and resentment bubbling up once more. I hesitated before responding. Meeting with Thomas filled me with both fear and anxiety, but also a sense that I needed to close this chapter of my life. Eventually, I agreed to the meeting. I wanted to ensure that our conversation would end things definitively and peacefully. We met at a small, cozy cafe that I chose to minimize any potential stress. When I saw Thomas, his expression was one of confusion and regret. He seemed as nervous as I felt and didn't know how to start the conversation. "I realize now that what I did was a mistake," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "I want to understand what led to this. Why did you go to such extremes?" I looked at him, trying to gather my thoughts. "Thomas, all this time I was trying to save us, but you didn't see how hard I was fighting. I found myself in a situation where there were no other choices. Your actions and indifference led us here. I cannot and do not want to continue a relationship that has so profoundly affected my life." Thomas was silent for a moment, staring at his coffee cup. He looked dejected and upset. I felt my heart tighten with pain, but I knew that this decision was necessary for my own peace. "I understand," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I began a new life, freed from the shadow of my past. One of the first steps I took was to remove my phone. It had been inundated with calls from collectors and threats, and I knew that as long as it remained with me, I couldn't fully let go of the past. I cut off all connections to that world that had brought me so much pain and fear. Now, I could focus on myself. I began to learn how to love and value myself despite the mistakes I had made. It wasn't easy, but I understood it was necessary for my own healing. I attended self-development classes, engaged in hobbies that brought me joy, and gradually rebuilt my confidence. Thomas also started a new life. He realized the importance of forgiveness and understanding. He was trying to correct his mistakes and learn from them. Although our paths had diverged, I saw that he too was searching for a way to move forward and build a new life, but with a deeper sense of understanding and compassion. The story of our lives and mistakes led us to new beginnings, but each of us found our own path to healing and self-awareness. We both recognized that mistakes are part of our journey, and it's important to learn from them to move forward. Sometimes, even the most painful mistakes can become the start of something new if we draw the right lessons from them. The freedom of choice lies in learning to let go of the past and build the future that we truly deserve.